Hallo, guten Abend, herzlich willkommen, liebe GABU Heindl, liebe Gäste und liebe ETH-Studierende und Mitarbeitenden. Im Namen vom ETH Wohnforum möchte ich euch herzlich willkommen zu dieser dritten internationalen Athena Lecture. Zum Athena Lecture Programm, es handelt sich dabei um ein Projekt, welches vom ETH Wohnforum 2020 lanciert wurde, und mit dem Ziel, formidable Wissenschaftlerinnen, Lehrende und Architektinnen ans DEARC einzuladen, damit Studierende und Mitarbeitende die Möglichkeit haben, mit ihnen zu diskutieren, kritisch nachzudenken und innovative Ideen zu fördern. Nach einer pandemiebedingten Pause oder vor allem on-live konnten wir uns leider nicht mehr treffen. Das ist jetzt zum Glück wieder möglich. Freuen wir uns nun, das Projekt weiter durchzuführen. Und wir werden auch nächstes Jahr wieder in Zusammenhang mit der Parity und Diversity Group des DEARCs und in Verbindung mit den Parity Talks diese Veranstaltung weiterführen. Übrigens eben die Parity Talks, worüber ihr später noch etwas in Details hört, die wird morgen stattfinden von 9 Uhr morgens bis 8 Uhr abends, und darauf kommen dann unsere Kollegen und Kolleginnen von der Parity Group noch zurück. Es ist meine Ehre, unsere heutige Gast, Frau Dr. Professor GABU Heindl, einführen zu dürfen. Sie ist Architektin, Stadtplanerin und Aktivistin aus Wien, und sie ist zurzeit Professorin an der TU Nuremberg. Sie hat in Wien, Tokio und Princeton studiert, und ihren Fokus ist auf öffentlichen Raum, öffentliche Bauten, bezahlbaren Wohnraum und Entziehung von Wohnen aus der Spekulation, also Finanzialisierungsprobleme. GABU ist die Autorin von verschiedenen Publikationen. 2 davon haben wir hier leider nur zur Besichtigung. Eines ist dieses Buch, Stadtkonflikte, das andere ein herausgegebenes Buch, Building Critique. Und sie ist auch die Mitarbeiterin von der Herausgeberin von Building Critique Architecture, und sie ist Discontent. Sie ist Professorin eben an der Technischen Hochschule in Nuremberg und dazu auch Dozierende an Architectural Association in London. In ihrem heutigen Vortrag Stadtkonflikte, radikale Demokratie in Architektur und Stadtplanung befasst sie sich kritisch mit der Rolle der Planung und Architektur im Kontext der aktuellen globalen Wohnkrise und Finanzialisierung vom städtischen Raum. Das Gespräch mit GABU Heindl und das im Vortrag anschließende Diskussion werden Frau Marie Glaser vom Bundesamt vom Wohnungswesen und ehemalige Leiterin vom ETH Wohnforum moderieren. Dazu kommt auch Linda Schürquist und Paul Schäfer von der Parity Group. Und ich danke euch herzlich für das Mitmachen in dieser Veranstaltung. Last but not least möchte ich auch das ETH und das ETH-Präsidium benennen und mich bei Ihnen bedanken für die finanzielle Unterstützung, die diese Veranstaltung möglich macht. Bevor wir jetzt einsteigen, möchte ich noch kurz Linda und Paul bitten, etwas zu den Parity Talks und zu der Parity und Diversity Group zu sagen. Nachher wird Frau Dr. Marie Glaser noch etwas sagen zu unserem Gast, und dann werden wir mit dem Vortrag weitermachen. Ganz herzlichen Dank für das Mitmachen, und wir freuen uns auf den Vortrag und dann aber auch auf eine spannende Diskussion.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to continue in English because since tomorrow it's going to be in English. So thanks for having this starting talk before the parity talk tomorrow. So it's going to be the 7th time that we're going to do those parity talks, and this time it's a little bit different. We're not going to have lectures the whole day long, but workshops with one discussion at the end of the day. So you're more than welcome to come. Each workshop are going to last 2.5 hours. It sounds long, but for a workshop, I promise you it's a good length. It's fine. And please feel free to come at 9 in the morning here. We're going to present the different workshops and also what's in them. And also, if you know people from the second year, they're going to have a special workshop in ONA to own the crits, which is also super interesting to involve also younger people, or younger. And yeah, I'm excited for the parity talk tomorrow, and also excited for this talk tonight. So yeah, thank you, and yeah, see you later. And all right. Yeah.
Also ich bin die Dritte, die jetzt was kurz sagt, aber ich lasse es mir nicht nehmen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass GABU Heindl bei uns ist heute. Sie ist in Wien und darüber hinaus sehr bekannt und sehr aktiv, und ich finde, es ist Zeit, dass wir in Zürich ihr auch Säle bieten, wo sie mit uns diskutiert. Ich schätze ihre Arbeit sehr als Architektin und als Intellektuelle und als Aktivistin und freue mich auf das Gespräch, das wir heute mit ihr führen. Wir werden es Deutsch und Englisch machen. Ich spreche jetzt aber auf Deutsch. Erst noch kurz meine 3 Sätze. Ihre Arbeit ist im Moment umso wichtiger, als wir auch in der Schweiz eine kritische Situation auf den Wohnungsmärkten, insbesondere in den Städten, erleben. GABU beschäftigt sich jahrelang damit, sie theorisiert das, kommt mit praktischen oder mit handlungspraktischen Initiativen, um dem zu begegnen, und ich finde, es tut Not, hier vielleicht auch neue Ansätze bekannt zu machen, bestehende Wohnraumpolitiken und Instrumente zu überdenken und zu ergänzen oder vielleicht auch zu ersetzen. Ich wünsche mir, dass wir einen Impuls kriegen heute Abend. Vielleicht sind auch andere Ideen im Raum. Also ihr alle habt Wirkungsmacht. Vielleicht wisst ihr auch noch etwas, das die Diskussion anreichert und uns alle bereichert. Ich wünsche uns einen schönen Abend und freue mich sehr. Los geht's.
Ich habe mein eigenes. It's really great to be live. I think that's really the most amazing thing. No, aside from the invitation here, thanks so much for the kind introductions. I was asked to lecture in English, and I was also asked to lecture from my practice. So I do start to introduce my book, which is nearly without images. So it's a lot of theory, history, and reflection on planning, on architecture, on how we actually can have agency, can gain agency, can find agency within a world of dilemmata, within a world of difficult ways of finding possibilities to still act. But I would like to actually show more like how I'm trying, we are trying in my practice to act within these situations. Yet we still want to, like my book is called Radikale Demokratie in Architektur und Stadtplanung, or the head title is Stadtkonflikte, Urban Conflict. And if we think, or I don't know if radical democracy theory is so well known here, it's a political theory that, for instance, if you know the name Chantal Mouffe or Jacques Rancière, different writers that have actually developed this theory. I draw a lot also on Oliver Machert, who is relating this theory to post-foundationalism. And to make it short, what radical democracy says in a nutshell is that in times that democracy is being questioned because of economical crisis, because of any sort of technical feasibility arguments and so on, for many reasons, and I think we see this all around the world. Radical democracy theory stands out and says we need to actually democratize democracy even more, because what we have as democracy isn't yet even like a perfect democracy, but rather than giving it up, is to radicalizing it. The radical is, of course, a very fashionable word, sorry. It's really meant to relate to radix, the radix is the root, yeah? To think questions, problems, issues on their roots, yeah? To think deep, to actually ask how could we change them. And that already brings us into a real problem, because architects usually cannot change deeply. Yeah? Architects are not in politics most often, but we all do politics. Yeah? So in this way, I think we are within a constellation that is super interesting, because at the end, we all know that architecture shapes the world. Architects are very important. I shouldn't say that, because then we get too self-aware. But architecture is important, maybe not so much architects. But we'll discuss this later. Radical democracy is also interesting, because the theorists come from different positions. And if I only take two of them, which have been very influential to my book, it's Jacques Rancière, who comes more from the anarchist bottom-up part of questioning and looking for alternatives. And Chantal Mouffe, who is a thinker, she actually claims that we must also work within the institutions. Yeah? So radical democracy does not say just outside, yeah? Or just inside, but basically the work is so much that we shouldn't choose, so to say, or we should actually take what we get, and we should see that we work in any kind of possibility and possible constellation. So within the institution, outside, within, as activists, but also taking top-down, taking kind of official commissions. And just to end with talking about the book is structured in 3 chapters. The 3 main chapters are called Politics, Planning, Popular Agency. It's not by coincidence that it's 3 Ps. It's a PPP. It wants to actually counteract or redefine something that has become so emblematic for financialization of urban space, which is public-private partnerships, PPP. PPP stands nearly iconically for sellout of public space, of public duties, of public goods, even of housing, and to say, okay, well, what we need is actually an engagement in politics and policies. We need to reflect what planning is and how we as planners, architects actually engage. And this is the third radical democracy issue. It's of course, if we think of how can we as architects be in between maybe politics and popular agency, meaning movements, activists, fighters for justice, and so on. So how could we actually find alliances on both sides? Okay, good. But today, because the main title of the book is Urban Conflicts, this is maybe one topic that I just left out. Radical democracy is also a conflict theory. Radical democracy says, okay, we need to acknowledge conflict, not as something bad, but actually that we need to have different positions and really talk about it and bring it about and confront each other. And also it relates to contingency as a term. Contingency meaning that there's always alternatives. Yeah? Radical democracy says in a time when the time tells us there's no alternative. I don't know if you know this term TINA. TINA, for short for there is no alternative. That's what we hear often. Even if you want to kind of put something fancy in your design, there may be no alternative because no money and so on. So there's no alternative, we hear that often. Radical democracy says the opposite, there's always alternatives. Yeah? And there's contingency. It's also a concept, a theoretical concept of saying that, of course, there has been changes throughout, there has been struggles, changes throughout history that we also need to acknowledge and see that there can always be a change. Good, that's why urban conflicts, and I want to start right away with public space, and I'm going to end, as you see in grey already, with with housing, of course, which is the core of Wohnforum. But housing is not only housing is also so much about public space, and I want to bring you right away or confront you right away with a project that we did some years ago. It's a project that is top-down, so commissioned by the city of Vienna, won as a competition, and it's about writing urban guidelines for the Viennese Donaukanal, which is the Danube Channel, the very central water line in Vienna, running right into the center of Vienna, and has become, in a time that the city of Vienna is already a very dense city, and it's highly densifying. It's growing like many cities. Yeah? A lot of people are still moving into Vienna. So what we did is, or how we won the competition is manifold, but we also, of course, looked at it as an enormously important free space, as a water line within the city, and compared it to bigger parks and actually showed how immense this space is. We also looked at it, and sorry, this is retrospective. This is a retrospect image, of course, but you can imagine that this area has been super important during Corona time. And I think in every city, public space has become very crucial for within quarantine or like lockdowns. So you see how it's been populated and loved so much. And of course, there was conflict with the police, like in every city with young people, etc. Throughout the years, like throughout the last 20 years, it has been also developed by the city of Vienna. There was actually incentives for investors to get down there, because it's a kind of channel, to bring infrastructure, to bring gastronomy in. And also it was some sort of public-private partnership to say, okay, well, the city of Vienna, the public doesn't build toilets, but we have restaurants built and toilets that people could use. Or, you know, you can kind of, we have a lot of benches, but of course it's commercial ones. Yeah? So when we took over this project, we found that aside from very nice, still kind of recreational areas, there was already super high pressure on commercialization of this place. And I mean, I find this image still like a diagram of that condition, because it basically shows how this gastronomy, how the urban beach gets closer and closer to the water and reduces again and again the space of the public, of those guys with kinder trolleys and so on, cyclists, etc. So there is actually a fight for public space, or who has a right to public space, or we could call it a conflict about the distribution of it. Also, of course, we have these restaurants leave the space after the summer and just put a fence all around it. And I would say this is also a crisis of policy, because actually the city of Vienna could have another policy of saying, okay, well, you clean it up again, yeah? You keep it open. This is actually funny, because at some point when it got so tight, the city of Vienna developed a fairness zone concept, which I found really incredible. Rather than enlarging the space, you keep the small space and ask everybody to be fair with each other. So in effect, it shows so much about how we deal with problems. Yeah? We don't take them at their roots, but then, okay, we have not enough space, but then we ask, dear people, be nice. So this is what we critiqued. We went through this area and really looked into and made super precise notes, looked at all the plannings that have been done throughout history, so to say, throughout the 100 years since Otto Wagner actually was working on this place. And so no worries, I don't want to get you into this complexity of the project, which we worked on for 3 years, and it has several layers, several different parts of the project, but I just want to show you three planning methods. One was that we translated this space as a linear space, and we read it as a partitur, which in English would be a choir, or would be a notation, yeah? Musical notation. So if you think it topographically, this is the area of our intervention, then we stretched it, and what that instrument, and this is a planning instrument, was really good in is that we have a lot of institutions, a lot of magistrate, it's called in Vienna, that are responsible in different ways for this place. So to actually find an abstract notational tool to say, okay, what's the rhythm of benches, water access, all the public infrastructure that we said that should be there in order to get independent of private investors providing with public infrastructure. So what we are claiming is to say the public should take care of public space to actually reduce and return the process of commercialization. So that is like we developed a series of such long partituren with ever different layers of infrastructure. And it was interesting because you could actually easily say where there were legs in this rhythm. And of course, you know, Vienna, Danube, music. So the partitur also helps in this sense of a reading. And the second instrument, and that has become actually even more referenced or people interested in, was that we developed a so-called non-building plan. Now in Vienna, or I'm sure also here, we have Bebauungspläne, building plans or zoning plans. And what we did is we said, okay, well, we have Bebauungspläne, building plans for what ought to be built. But we do not have plans with the same sincerity, same kind of rhetorics for what has not to be built, what should not be built, what should ever be kept unbuilt. So that is like basically turning around the logic of the building plan into a non-building plan. And then what we did, we capered, so to say, the same language. It was very important to us. You know how building plans are difficult to read. Actually, sometimes I give workshops to help people read such plans. In this case, we were conscious of saying we also want to dedicate importance to public space by calling it FA, FAZ, FA star, PA. So in a way, we took the same language and translated it into a plan that says, okay, no area around the water can ever be built on. It has to have so much distance from the water. All these beautiful little stairs that are on the water can never be commercialized or commodified, and so on. We looked into the symmetry of the space and said all the accesses to the water always have to be straight and directly for the public, etc. It seems to be nearly redundant issues, but never, I mean, since nobody has written it down on paper, it was always matter of negotiation. Yeah? A lot of restaurants would have been happy to sit just next to a beautiful Otto Wagner stair and have it already built 100 years ago and profit from it. And then the public could not right away go down to the water. So to have such nearly redundant things be written and planned and drawn up is, I would say, like as crucial and as much work. It's to do a non-building plan, also saying to do nothing does not mean, or not to do anything does not mean to do nothing. Or it's an active goal. Yeah, it's a lot of work sometimes. What we did, it's like it can be complexified. These drawings, this, for instance, is a so-called potential zone, which we then try to activate and see that the city of Vienna also implements public infrastructure and makes it possible for people to kind of rent this place for a day or half a day. And this is, for instance, a very well people like to do parties there. While we were doing this plan, there was an investor, because of Pachtvertrag, a leasehold that was given for life of this piece of land on these beautiful stairs. This is historic, 100 years old, you couldn't build such a stair anymore. And we literally saw a project of an investor building over these stairs to have his restaurant or her restaurant really close to the water. So while we were already doing this plan for the city of Vienna, so we logically went to the city of Vienna and said, like, listen, full stop, you must stop this project. We already had our non-building plan for this area, which, as you can see, is red, completely, because it's like the stair is, all of that is worthful area for the public. And it took actually quite some emergency meetings to make sure that the deal was actually cut off, which was nearly already signed. And if you know, like when it comes to financialization of public space, of urban space, of any space, speed is always the topic. It has to be quick and it's always urgent from those who want to actually commercialize public space, or who want to have organized profit. And just to say one thing in advance, when I critique financialization of urban space, then I do not critique investors, because investors' goal is to invest and to make money. Who I critique is actually either us, to have that happen as citizens, as architects, and of course politics. yeah, and of course planning departments, because this is where it's important to take the mandate of the public. And that's, I think it's crucial, because it's so often so misunderstood that, okay, it's again, it's not critiquing those in their wish to actually feed from urban space, but we need to see where is the public being taken care of. So yeah, we actually, so to say, won the case. We made that. We made sure that it's not built over. Every time I pass by, I think I built it myself, or I planned it, which of course is not the case. But it's also important to really. I really feel it's a beautiful place if you ever go to Vienna. A second time, just about when we finished, we had already finished the urban guidelines. They were taken by the city of Vienna, put in a shelf, as happens so often. This was an area, the last one, the last beautiful, I can show you here, grass on the water, sunny, everything, not yet a restaurant. And in the moment, actually, of us having finished the project, disappearing, a restaurant owner with a politician said, well, beautiful place, 800 persons, gastronomy, perfect. Our plan was in the shelf, but, and this was quite amazing, a citizen group, a protest group, actually squatted, sat on the grass, asked for collected signatures, and most beautifully, they referred to our plan, yeah? Actually told the city of Vienna, well, you just paid a plan with public money, which says clearly this area is not to be built on, and we want you to make that, to stand with your plans. So without them, our plan would have be worthless. Also because it never turned into a kind of legal plan. It was only a kind of a self-statement of the city, but it was actually them who activated, this is what we would want to say here, the protest activated if there ever was a political potential in the plan. You may inscribe political potentials in your plans, you may kind of hope, but architects alone can only do so much. But what was beautiful is that here these activists were themselves active, of course, but also related and reminded the city. So this is really what top-down, bottom-up convergence, I feel like at a very interesting stage. So it's planning and popular agency kind of politicized. And or what we could call, what I called critical setting. What we did as architects and planners, we set an argument, a position, red on white, in space. It was not something that everybody liked. Actually, a lot of, even those who commissioned us, were hopeful that we would give urban guidelines in terms of saying, you know, that so many people want to build down there, in what color and in what material could be built. So we could have actually written a corporate identity booklet for how it could be commercialized. What we did is like, well, we don't even care if it's blue or green or wood or steel, because if it's small, temporary, within a certain rhythm, it's okay. It could be free. And this is also what public space is about. So what we did was we set a clear position on paper, which is really in a way disputable, but also it's conflictual. Yeah, it is contra the development that was planned. In German, I called it kritische Setzung. It's one chapter in this book where I theorize how we, as planners, also relate to us, because whenever we make choices, the question always is, how come you make the choice for so many people? Yeah? How come you know better than others what is good for the people? And of course, we don't know better. But we said there's an alternative to what everybody thinks that is logical that it will develop. That does not mean that it should not be debated. But because we wrote it down, we drew it, it's on the table and it can be discussed. And of course, people can say, no, we want it completely different, but we all know what we're talking about. And that's the difference to negotiation urbanism, where we have no plan on the table, and still the public or the urban space is being negotiated. So that's the argument of the critical setting in terms of a plan. Okay, so I'm entering the second part of my talk, public buildings. I want to start with a really small project, and I'm showing it even not long enough. But I was commissioned. I won a small competition for an art in architecture project for a prison, an existing prison. For a prison courtyard, actually. And I was really in a huge dilemma because, in fact, actually, I'm against prisons. And I was even like, and I was looking, I was visiting it, and then I asked here, they told me this is where men spend their free hours. And I said, like, that's impossible. And I asked, where do they play football? And then they told me, well, there's no place for football, and anyway, they don't like it because they play with their cell phones. And so basically, because there was no place, suddenly it turned out that they didn't want to. So even though everybody declared that there was no place for a football field, actually we designed one. I don't have the full project here now. Even on the side that I'm standing here, it makes a fold. And I only wanted to bring this project for one argument, which is, we could have done nothing, or we could have done some embellishment. And what we tried is to say, okay, could we, for the sake of it, everybody says it's not possible, we fold a football field into this space, but also, so we do something, hopefully a tiny little bit better, in a really not good situation. But also, this fold reminds us that something is too small, or the architect is stupid. It could also be that the architect did a mismeasuring. Yeah? But you could also be reminded that this place is too small for even a Bambini football field, which in fact it was. So in fact, if nobody talks about it, it just sits there, and maybe it's even hopefully joyful or funny for people to look at. But every time I speak about it, and every time it's published, it can actually be a reminder of that this is not yet the solution. Yeah, it's what I also theorize is a non-solution. It's a solution, but it still has a non. Yeah, it's not yet. It's not what it's meant to be. It also relates to that it's not rightly measured. There's a mismeasurement in the space, and unfortunately, this I only have in German. This is a quote I really like a lot. It's by Wittgenstein, and I try to translate it in English. It says, if you take the ruler to the table, do you measure the table or do you measure the ruler? So what we have to do is we also have to actually remeasure or question our rulers. By what do we measure? What are our tools or techniques to know that something is big enough or small enough? Yeah? How big should an apartment, or how maximally small can an apartment be? Who says that? Yeah? Who rules that out, so to say? Okay, so public buildings. I'm just showing you a school extension that we did in our office, like six beautiful 60s building. We extended by these two buildings. Just to give you a quick context, nice to add something which then brought not only didn't have two outdoor spaces, but suddenly we had 5 courtyards for this place, which is the Zehnergasse, is the street that the school is in. So this is like an urban setting, but what I would really want to show you is that even so in the Donaukanal project, we did not ask anybody to do our critical setting. And now a lot of people asked us, why didn't you then kind of be participatory? And we said, well, we didn't really know how to include 2 million Viennese into a process. Yeah? So there's something about equity planning, or like strong planning, to say sometimes you take responsibility for a large group. But for instance, here it's 1,000 kids, and we did, of course, workshops and work together with them, etc., what we very often do. But what I really want to show you is this roof. Because in fact, we asked for a full roof terrace over the entire terrace. And again, there is no alternative to it. Actually, we were asked to have none. because there was not enough money. And the best argument was by the responsible for all the schools in Lower Austria. He said, if we build a roof terrace on this school, every other school wants one too. And this cannot happen. So now you can obviously know that we absolutely wanted a roof terrace up there, logically. And we just squeezed so much money out of it that we could do a small one. And of course, we wanted the big one. And what we did actually together with everybody knowing, we put steel infrastructure, steel structure all around the edge here to, in a time when there's money again, to still have the big one. And why am I bringing this in? Because very often we are in our practice or in our lives or in our kind of actions, we cannot get all, or we cannot change it right away, or we have to fight and it's only a compromise. The question is, how could we be active in the now and not close an even greater change for the future? And that's something that I really learned from this project and from others, to say, okay, can you try to again and again ask yourselves to include in your work or actions a possible bigger change, no? That you may not be able to at this moment achieve. Sometimes it doesn't work so nicely. The city of Vienna actually declared in 2019 to do all the next 10 big school campuses as a public-private partnership project. It was an enormous, an amazing moment in the city, in the architecture field, because it made us all discuss and it really politicized the architecture field in Vienna. One project by Architekt, I'm sure people know it. They also showed, even though it's fairly nice, but it was very clear that you'd lose the quality control if the private investor has the say over the school. So the architects are not commissioned anymore till the end. That's the technical part of it. The non-technical part of it is that actually public money is constantly flowing into private profit with public-private partnerships in schools. So what the architects did is half of the architects joined the competition, and another half also joined the competition, but sent in such a poster. So again, they didn't just not join, but they sent a poster. It's all different architectural offices saying, I will not plan this public-private partnership school. I will not join this process. And I think it was a very powerful moment. We would even wish some more protests or even strikes of architects would happen, to just say, no, we don't do it. Okay, so now we are at the core of the evening, of course, housing conflict. So I'm starting with London is because I've been teaching the last 3 years in London at the AA, and we have from the beginning looked in also, not during Corona, we had a more international group, but especially into the London policies. And I'm just giving you some to set up a context. This is the beautiful Battersea Power Station that is just being developed hugely with lots of investment money. A student of mine looked carefully into it, into all Section 106 agreements, etc., everything, but also into the very interesting moment that there had to be, or in the negotiation with the city, logically there was social housing in this area. And throughout the process, also quite logically it seems, it disappeared. And social housing moved right out, affordable housing it's called, here into this edge next to the railway, super dense, and all the affordable housing moved out of the area, of the kind of key area, nice area, at the edge next to the railroads, and not so good quality. One pattern that we realized in many projects, actually I could give a whole lecture just on these projects, because the student was brave enough to then calculate the gain of the developers, and then was asked by a colleague, but how can you actually dare to calculate? How could you even know it? You know, I mean, like, how would you be so crazy? You must make mistakes, yeah? And then she said very bravely, sure, my calculation surely has a mistake. Yeah? But you know what? Every 5 months or 3 months or second month, the investors always tell the public, oh, we made a mistake. We can only build less affordable housing. Oh, we made a mistake. Yeah? We now have to move them out because it's not the right calculation. So while the mistake on the one side is clearly taken as logically or granted, the student is questioned for being brave enough to recalculate, yeah? To actually really look into it. That's something that we do more and more, to really dare and bravely look into the numbers. But then also another student looked at the triangle site and looked how by year, in 2006, the Section 106 agreement said so much affordable housing, and in 2019 it was so few percentage. And this pattern just is everywhere in the world, let's say, even in Vienna. We have beautiful triple housing complex. It was before a public amenity. Now it has different real estate companies. The Austrian real estate company is even still public, but one entire tower is only micro apartments for students, the new fashionable way to build. And even so, also in this urban deal, also so städtebaulicher Vertrag, it's called, there was some apartments, some social housing apartments negotiated. At the end, there was zero, because technically it was not possible and had to move somewhere else. And you always get technical rhetorical arguments for that it's not possible. Again, this like that there is no alternative to it. Yeah? And of course, as you can imagine, there's something that we need to oppose. Giancarlo De Carlo in the 1970s, I think was already very rightly referring beautifully to how we architects are too complicit. And he referred to the architects of the 1920s who did work their most creativity into super small apartments, yeah, into the Wohnung für das Existenzminimum. And I'm sure you all know them beautifully, like things fold up and down and so on. And I think he is so great in just asking, okay, well, great that you managed the how, but sadly so that you never asked why or what you're doing. Yeah? Why are you doing that? Who gains from that? And whose losses is that you are actually hiding the fact that people have to live on ever smaller spaces. It's interesting, of course, now with the ecological crisis, the question is, in fact, shouldn't apartments get smaller? But again, and Marie Glaser has done a lot of work on that, and also I'm sure the whole Wohn Forum, the question is, again, who defines whose apartment should be smaller and whose shouldn't? Because we see on the other side 500, 600 square meter apartments on the market. I sometimes do that. I don't know if you like to do that, reading Immobilia websites. So that's why housing conflict is actually maybe the biggest conflict at the moment. I myself, I'm involved. This is why I call myself activist, even though it's not so fashionable within the architecture field. But I do think if we understand housing as a public issue and as an architectural issue, then we also ought to actually relate and link ourselves, find allies within these moments. I was myself organizer of the Donnerstags, co-organizer with a lot of people of the Donnerstags demos in Vienna against the right-wing government and also the harshness of housing. And even there, as an architect can be used to draw maps, to design routes through the cities where you can actually find about financialization on site, walk them, and then we did a beautiful flyer because we have so many Befristungen in Austria. So we said it should be unbefristet, etc. So I even had I must say, the pleasure of speaking in front of a lot of people. Often here, this is the same moment of a protest with the Benga boys when we actually cut when the government fell, so to say. It's quite amazing. 50,000 people, and after your speech, the Benga boys are singing, and. But however, I want to come to this moment. I often spoke with Regina Amea. She's a housing activist, a homeless activist. She was homeless herself, and we found a good pair to actually speak together, because not just the expert, but also another expert in her activism. And I learned a lot from her. She basically, for instance, said, so often we call somebody socially weak, sozial schwach. Yeah? Socially weak is only the system that allows people to be so financially weak. Yeah? Or so financially weakened even. And it has to be very clear that we need to work on our language as architects, yeah? And all as citizens generally. So she was also part of a book that we did, of a research project commissioned by the city of Vienna, of the condition of women and working women, and how they have troubles in finding housing. And within this context, we did actually look back into early housing studies, and for instance, this Housing the Single Woman by Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. I love Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. I knew her, I was her neighbor and sub-renter in Vienna. But yet, we still have to actually critique it, because what she did very naturally, logically, is draw up housing for the female worker, this space, for the female academic, this space, logically. And the problem is that we are not any further. We are not a thing further. We absolutely, housing is separate. Housing is given to those who have a lot of money, you have a lot of square meters, except for, of course, there's contingency moments, histories, relatives, etc. But generally, you have money, you get more square meters, less money, less square meters. Very sad. I mean, we did a study then with parameters, another story, another lecture, but very interesting. How could you today, and you get into pure dilemmata, because you would need to change the system completely. So that's what actually made me really, and this will be my research field for the next years, and I'm so happy sometimes to work with activists all around the world. Just recently we had a talk with the Asia Pacific rental organizations, and then, you know, if you see how renting is a real issue in other countries, of course I feel really weird to talk about Vienna, but this is what I will do here. In the 1920s, between World War I and II in Vienna, it was the time of so-called Red Vienna. And this is also in the first chapter of my book on politics. It's the major case study, because I found it interesting, because it's a realized reform, utopia, or it's an amazing moment in a way. All around Vienna, you find of 64,000 housing units, it's like quite many buildings, you find this still today. It says, built by the city of Vienna in the year so-and-so by the means of the housing tax. The housing tax was an extremely progressive tax that took much more money from the rich to distribute to those, and not directly to the people, but into infrastructure for those who needed housing, for workers' housing. It was also called a luxury tax. It taxed luxury. Yeah? It didn't tax kind of flat, but it taxed exactly there where you could tax. And this tax is proudly written on the facade of these Gemeindebauten, communal housing buildings that are still existing today and are still communal. Now, in the same city in Vienna, we also read such sentences on the wall, and I'm going to read it. It's so small. You don't have to live in these apartments. You don't have to live in these apartments to love Vienna. Owning them will do. It's not ad-busting. It's another very serious way of and now you go through the city and it's like you want to sell your house and so on. I mean, I'm sure you have all of that also here. So that makes us really, and this is what made me say, okay, we need to critically inherit the history. Yeah? We don't need to inherit everything, but we need to see what we could inherit. So what we sometimes doing, we did a series, for instance, of collages, where we said city house, maybe not anymore Gemeindebau or so, then maybe not anymore built by the city, but made possible by the city. We can discuss, yeah, like we have 2022 in the future years, and then we discuss by the means of which tax. Should we write CO2 tax here, ecology taxes, inheritance tax, rich tax, you name it, yeah? But I would wish if we could actually, if you imagine that people would actually see where taxes go into, but also see the pleasure that taxes could make a change. It's one way of making a change. I also made a little greeting cards for Berlin. And I sent it to them before the Volksentscheid to say, okay, well, it's expropriated and made nice, greenified, whatever, by the city of Berlin. And then again, because the discussion is so strongly about, oh, even the expropriation, it can never be sold, it can never be bought. It can never have enough. Does everybody know about the Berlin case? Okay, well, maybe we discuss it afterwards. But Berlin was it September? Was quite an amazing that there was a big initiative which is called Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Enteignen, so to expropriate large housing corporations that own more than 3,000 units. So you could easily argue that they don't need it for themselves, which is also to actually expropriate, or what we could also call to collectivify, to vergesellschaften, to socialize, no, to communalize, communalize or expropriate these housing units. And it was, the population of Berlin was asked, and nearly 60%, I think 57 point something percent said yes. And that's enormous, and it's amazing because this word by itself is so charged, of course, that to bring people to I would say to the yes in such a Volksentscheid, it also really means that people know there has to be a change. And well, but what you can see, and here is, I didn't realize I have the protest here. It's interesting to look into that. But what I mean with such collages is that we can actually learn from the past and project it into the future, and actually see how we as architects can also create images or ideas of like another way of policing. Just quickly about Red Vienna, just to be informative. At this time, it created 64,000 communal housing units. The number was amazing. It had 6 to 8% of the income was to be paid for rent. If I just ask, how many of you pays more than 30% of your income for rent? Oh, nobody. Good. Oh, nobody, but now everybody. Just thinking quickly, just imagine how much that is compared to 6%, 8% was very low number. We can also discuss that. But also all around city, and I just want to bring these preconditions to your into our thinking. Red Vienna couldn't have done that. It inherited from the war and so on a good rent control or rental protection. Actually, it meant that rents couldn't be raised. People couldn't be thrown out of their apartments. So what it means is if you cannot make money by somebody else's housing needs, profit, private investors didn't have interest anymore in building private housing because the profit is somewhere else. So actually they didn't build anymore, which nearly was a crisis. By that also meant that the land prices dropped, because if there is no speculation on making profit with housing, there's no speculation on making profit with land. So now you would have governments that say, we need to make the private build, so put out incentives, give them land for cheap and so on. And what the city of Vienna then did was to buy the land and build themselves. Just also another example that it could be done differently. There's no need to always keep the supposed unquestioned track. Of course, you know the Karl Marxhof. This is my student from the AA. It's famously, like so many people visit it. Today, there's 50% of the Viennese living in municipal or subsidized housing. Vienna never sold it, etc. So this is why Vienna has become such an enormous momentum also within the world. There's a lot of diversity. It's quite interesting that you will never get thrown out in Vienna of your housing unit. So you may start in your communal housing unit as a student and become a politician, which he himself is, and he was big person of debate because everybody said like he should go. And he said, like, no, I stay, because it's my right. Because it's the right that you're not been thrown out. And it's here only a question, and I had my students discuss that a lot. Should he go or should he stay? And the nice thing is that the students finally said, like, no, that's not the right question. Should we have more communal housing? So that we don't discuss that. And that's the thing. You know, you just start the third kind of group of saying, no, we have 80% eligible persons in Vienna would be eligible for social housing, and we have 50 to 60%. So there is a competition. So it could be that we would have to say, well, then let's have 80%. How is another question, of course. Okay, this now it gets a bit technical. Maybe I'm getting quicker over this. Renting could be really an amazing strategy, generally for society, only it needs trust. Why? Because if you build a house and it gets paid off, the rent could drop. And this is what in association housing in Vienna is the rule, that these rental prices have to drop after the housing, the debt has been paid off. If it doesn't drop, what you have in public or in any sort of kind of collective housing, this would be a solidarity contribution that could be handed into more collective housing, into more public housing. If you, sorry, this goes too quick now. If you don't have this rent control and if it's private, what happens is you have a house built or renovated, some capital expenditure. It goes down over the years, let's say 30 years or so, and then it's ridiculous because when the rent should go down, the rent goes up. So this is pure private profit that is being produced there. Or you could also say and then we would have to say if it's communal or cooperative, again you'd actually have a sort of solidarity contribution. And if you think of, now I've just doubled my diagrams, but even if you think of rent control, you still have private profit, but you could actually say you could rent, if you freeze the rent, there's still by the years more and more profit to be made. So freezing the rent is not a big issue, but of course by those who don't want it frozen, it's made a big issue. So we need to actually create arguments and also know the issues. Okay, in Vienna, as in every other place, because you can make profit and money, the ratio is changing from non-profit to free market developers. I'm giving you a lot of Vienna's. Is this too much now to give you these details? No? Yeah? You like it? It's a little bit, it just becomes a little bit numbers. But, and also it's funny, I'm sorry, every time I'm outside of Vienna, I sound like the marketing person of Vienna. And if I'm inside Vienna, believe me, I'm really a heavy critic of everything that goes wrong. So it's like I'm in a weird position that I do think that a lot of it, that we can learn from a lot of it, and I'm sparing you quite some problems that are within the system also.
I actually expected that you come up also with a critical position on the Vienna model today.
Yes, no. I'm absolutely critical, and I just showed it before. For instance, Vienna, as I said, there's not, even though there's a lot, there's not enough social housing. So what we have is a Viennese policy, a Viennese first policy, absolutely awful. A lot of us are actually fighting against it. That if you don't have the right passport, if you haven't lived long enough in Vienna, then you are not eligible or ever placed on the last ranks. So there's a lot of real critical, it's highly paternalistic. This is, I write about this a lot here also. This is what I mean by critically inherited. Yeah? We should not inherit the whole package, which means that we inherit extreme paternalism, top-down knowing how we want to live, standardized housing, exclusion parameters, and. But what I do think is at this moment so much needed is actually policies that show that there could be a difference. So there's a lot of housing subsidies in Vienna. As you can see here, millions, and they're all, most of it is object subsidy, meaning the money goes into the built infrastructure of housing, and not subject subsidy, meaning I give money to a person to then pay too high rent, a rent too high to a private person. That would be transfer of public money to the private person, to private. But for some time Vienna couldn't even spend this housing subsidy. Why? Because there was no more land available that was cheap enough. Cheap in terms of land has to be of a low price as a base for social housing to be low price. So that's why, and this is really, I would say, remarkable. Again, I'm the marketing person. No, but just bring you the good news. Vienna introduced a zoning category which is called not housing, but subsidized housing. And if this zoning category is placed on a piece of green land, then it means that more than 2/3 of this land has to be turned or built into subsidized housing. And subsidized housing by law relates to a land price which is down to nearly 1/10 of what is the land price on the market. So what this effectively is a land cap. A land cap, price cap. And this is quite remarkable because we've been discussing this for very long via this construction. And at once, speculators on land said, well, we are being quasi-expropriated of our future profits that we are already hoping for. Yeah? We still only own a piece of land that's worth so much, but I was sure that it would be worth so much, and now the government can just do that. And the fact is, it can just do that. And that's that's my only message. There's much more possibilities policy-wise in urban planning and in the kind of mandate of the public than we would think. Vienna has a land procurement and urban renewal fund, meaning public lands for the commune. That's also like there shouldn't be any selling of land and so on. I'm praying to the converted, I'm pretty sure. I'm going quickly. Vienna, by owning lands, it can actually have a quality control via so-called funded housing or competitions or limited profit social housing competitions. Now, okay, finally, next one project, only like a couple of projects, and so we are back kind of to the practical part. This is based on this housing study, Women Working Wohnen. We were invited to do a developer competition. These are these competitions that the city of Vienna can do on these pieces of land that are social housing dedicated. And I just want to show you, I mean, this is our scheme. In these competitions, we hand in that, which is really fairly a lot. Every apartment is drawn, all calculated. It's all it's in combination with, in this case, we worked with 2 limited profit housing associations. And this is literally a contract with the city that if we would be given this piece of land, then we have to deliver this quality. No. And what I would also want to show you is that this project has 100% social housing. It has a roof pool, a roof garden, event hall, community centers, and so on. And this is not a dream project. It's a dream project. I mean, we designed it. It's a nice project. But what I mean is, like, it's not dreamy in the sense that we did all the calculations together with the developers that you can, of course, have in social housing a swimming pool on the roof. Because at the end, with the mass of houses, with 300 apartments, it doesn't make a difference to the rental price anymore. So you can actually... That's the beauty. It's luxury by mass, yeah, or through the mass of these housing units. What is also interesting, the site was this and that, and we of course had a very complicated master plan that we already had to follow. But this piece couldn't be developed because it was already taken by a private developer where the piece of land then where the city doesn't have this level of control over it. So I'm just going to quickly move over this. I could show you a video, but only the starting point, because of course we started the video with the swimming pool on the roof that we were so proud of, and everything in housing is green at the moment, of course. I'm going to stop that here. But, how do I do that? Yes. But the reference is also famous. You all know it. Alt Erla, but believe me, it's not the only social housing complex. This is a kind of in Vienna that has a swimming pool on the roof. So tell this to my students in London, and they all now plan housing with swimming pools on the roof. But of course, the problem really is that also here it has to be fought for, and it's not kind of the standard, it's not the norm, and then again the translation into other contexts is even more complex. So what we're actually talking about is whether in big scale, top-down solidarity economy, or also in smaller scale. And I want to end with 2 small-scale projects which do the opposite. And now back to radical democracy. It is working within the system, but also outside the system. And outside the system is a group, it's called SCHLOA. SCHLOA is the abbreviation for Schöner Leben ohne Reifeisen, oder Schöner Leben ohne Rendite, oder Schöner Leben ohne Räumungen. And they managed literally to not need a bank. By crowdfunding, they organized themselves 3.5 million euros for their project. This is a drawing that we did of their sites that I show you in a moment, where there's existing galleries, not galleries, existing workshops and existing hall, etc. And they're developing a training center, a circus center, then living and working together, workshops, etc. All of that non-profit, also for the neighborhood and for themselves to live in. This is the site, the way they found it, and the way they bought it out of the market. And what this model is. Hold on, I'm just, so this is their, they were all over the city because of their fundraising campaign to get enough money to say, okay, I'd rather have 1,000 friends in my back than a bank in my neck. I think that's the right way of saying it. So you motivate people to spend the money, to not put it into the bank, but actually here you can have 0, 1 or 2% even. No bank gives you 2% at the moment. You give a loan to this group and they will give you back, because they will then rent their house that they built, and by the rent, by the same diagram I just showed you, they will pay back the loan. They are also part of a group in Austria, setting up the sister organization to the Mietshäuser-Syndikat. I don't know is this fully known to all of you? Mietshäuser-Syndikat is a German structure that in Austria it's being called Habitat now. It's a syndicate structure that of different associations that actually literally buy land and houses off the free market, of the private market, and by buying it, then at once collectivizing it by linking it into this syndicate structure so that it's forever not possible to speculate with it anymore, and that it's within this structure dedicated to affordable housing, and a scheme that is also a solidarity scheme. Why? Because again, if they freeze the rent, they don't drop it, at some time, after some while, what becomes a gap can become a solidarity contribution to new projects, to actually work on decapitalizing the housing market. So this is our scheme, first level, second level. I don't hear this part we already just finished. We're just starting on this one to have a wooden 2-floor house, and then third phase we will refurbish this hall. We try to keep as much as possible, and then just build on top. So this is all old, this is new, etc. It's we can at some point when it's finished. I'm happy to show the whole project. And the other one that I wanted to show that we did a little bit earlier, we called it intersectional city house long before the term intersectional now is kind of so in everybody's mouth. We worked on it 2014-15. It was, of course, also already the question of intersectional marginalities that a lot of people are experiencing. In this case, it was a group of people that found themselves together, who work together with the so-called queer base in Vienna, support refugees that flee because of their sexual orientation, work together with barrier freeness, people that have to use wheelchair, etc. So the group of people living together is extremely intersectional. And the house, the project is also intersectional because what we did is they found an entire house to rent as one thing on willhaben.at, which is amazing, after years of searching. What we as architects did, we supported them to build an elevator in there, to renovate it as cheaply as possible, to help them then move into a mostly barrier-free, accessible house. This is the leftover of a workshop where the last half hour I just followed them with wide open eyes because they also live solidarity economy literally. So here they just had all the money calculated they need to pay in a month to pay back debt and rent. And everybody there pays only how much he can. So it's exactly the opposite of I have a lot of square meters because I need to move my wheelchair and I need to pay more and the other one has less. But they are literally doing this other system that could be interesting. Yeah? And again meeting, and of course they have conflicts, but they reorganize themselves to always bring together this money, but make sure that if you're not good in money at some point, then you pay less and the other person pays more. So they call themselves literally an association for accessibility in life, in thinking and in art, if that's the right translation. And they think barrier-freeness, accessibility in multiple ways. We understand it very often as architects just that every wheelchair can reach every corner. But it also means that not only physically, but also economically, that you can afford to live however you want, and they want to live in a big one-kitchen house. They're a big community, they don't have any single apartments, and they also want, it also doesn't matter socially, it doesn't matter what color of the skin you are, etc. That's beautiful. So we have laid out for them different working places. Everything in this house is part of the one community. There's no corridor that is not living room. So this is part of the kitchen, and just briefly, what I believe what they are doing is they are again, learning from history. It's not even maybe so conscious, but there was a self-help movement in the 1920s when there was so much housing need. People starting to build themselves on the empty lands outside the city. It's something which we cannot do anymore. I mean, the land is also scarce, but it means building yourself within the city. Yeah, it's another settlers movement, if you want to. And they refer to a very early feminist concept of one kitchen house, to share amenities, to have a one kitchen in the ground floor and only private spaces on top. So interesting kind of remaking of historic concepts. And now this is what I'm ending with. At this moment on Thursday, it's the finissage. I'm having a little exhibition in Brno and within that I'm currently actually working on a housing manifesto which I will present for the finissage. And I started this housing manifesto in the gallery. You can see here it's based on the words of care, and it's structured around these words, and I've shown you all of kind of these aspects, be it on the kind of policy level, be it on the planning level, or being on the popular agency level. And this is the entrance there, which quotes Leilani Fahi, but also many other people logically saying housing is a human right, not a financial product. And because we are close to the 8th of March, I just wanted to bring in some of my allies from the past. I'm sure you know them all: Hannah Arendt, Spivak, Silvia Federici, Chantal Mouffe, and my all-time favorite, Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really liked your lecture. I think it was quite understandable. I asked GABU not to dive too deeply into theoretical conceptions and philosophy, but of course we can do that if you're interested. And I have questions, but maybe I open up the round of questions either to you or to the audience. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for the lecture. It was super interesting, and I think also in Zurich we see a lot of those competition with public-private partnership, and we always see the housing, subsidized housing, or for Genossenschaft, it's always like a small corner, and it's often the bad corner of the plot. So here it's like it's not only a Zurich problem, I guess it's a European problem. And yeah, it was really interesting to see that, and also that there was already existing models to like help each other, and that maybe we should not thinking there's already existing ones that we could retake and kind of remake it for today. I don't know.
Wollen Sie nebeneinander sitzen?
Okay, will do. Thank you. Yeah, actually, likewise, I really like this lecture, especially how you bring practical or your practice as kind of a theory, and then at the same time you flip the script and criticize theory. Even people that you admit to admire, I actually found that quite brave, and that's when critical thinking comes back again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any question in the public, but I can maybe ask one. When you started to talk about your first project about public space around the Donau, I also saw during my bachelor, I did a small research with a friend about public-private partnership, but on the Elbphilharmonie, and they also have a kind of plaza on it to say, oh, we have something public, or another building, the Copen Hill in Copenhagen, with the kind of ski plaza on it, and they have those big infrastructure, and they kind of financed by the private, but also proposed by the public, and saying to people, we have something for you. So I was wondering, what do you think about this, or those architecture? Or
I just 2 weeks ago I had a lecture just on public-private partnerships. Do you still hear me? Yeah. In Copenhagen, because they actually have, it's the same system and logic in slight variations everywhere. And this is where we really looked and compared also even all the rhetorics, because very often in public-private partnerships or in such projects, the public is made to believe that they're just presented with a gift. No? A nice ski hill, or I don't know, in Albania, a national theater building had to go down for a public-private partnership shopping mall with a national now theater as part in the shopping mall. And if we forget the history, we may think, oh, how nice the shopping mall made place for some theater. But actually the theater made place for the shopping mall. Yeah? So, I give you another example. In Vienna, in so-called Herrengasse, it says a lot already, in the kind of historic Herrengasse where there's the Herrenhäuser, and most of these buildings are owned by the Blaschik Group, which is Reves, Billa and so on, and a lot of other palais. They were by the city planning, they just didn't make it into the pedestrian area. So the owners of this house said to the city of Vienna, you know what, we want our street to be pedestrian area, we pay it ourselves. You don't have to pay anything. We give it as a gift to you. City was happy, sold it as a gift. If you look closer, it would be tax money that could be nicely dedicated to a pedestrian area in the workers' district. The moment it was built for some few million euros, the prices and the revenues of the houses and apartments went up like this. So what it was a great investment into their own kind of front garden, while not sharing kind of their over money, so to say. What?
The reverse income.
The reverse income with the public. So very often we see within these deals and within these public-private partnerships, and logically, we see an uneven relationship. This is actually what Chantal Mouffe, this philosopher, you wouldn't believe it, that you even find very early, I put this into my book, a critique on public-private partnerships, where she analyzes how this is not a partnership. It's called partnership, but it's not. Because the public, okay, is one partner, the private is another partner. Because of the way these deals are set up, the deals are intransparent and not public. Because the right to privacy is stronger than the right of the public to also know about it. So, and then we have an ever-shrinking public administration. With austerity politics, we have to save money in the governments, in the city administration, etc. So we have very small negotiation teams versus negotiation teams that are possibly very big, or at least know very well what they want, logically. So it's very imbalanced relationship and not a partnership anyway. So this is why I believe, that's why I literally dedicated my book as an alternative to it, in terms of, if we think of the political responsibility when it comes to public space, and I include housing there, I think housing is a public duty, then we need politics, planning, and the population, and those who live, we all, to work together and claim that there can be alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
No, thank you, GABU, for the talk. It was great to also link it to your project. So, what I was wondering, like concerning the situation in Berlin, but also in Switzerland, that some of try to imagine investors that make a profit from buildings, but that in the worst case, through the financialization of real estate or land as a financial product, most of the time it's even us, with pension funds, like for example, if you see the kind of Swiss housing market, but even if you have open and closed funds internationally, they kind of in the end gentrify Berlin in their housing production, but we are kind of embedded in this system of a kind of financial product selling market. So I think you showed one way of where to cut the string, for example, if a government decides to freeze land prices for social housing with a zoning plan. But do you also, like in your circles, discuss where are the other kind of entanglements where we are all kind of involved in that system that produces high prices?
Absolutely. I mean, we just had a beautiful exhibition in the Architecture Center of Vienna, where and I also did studies on land politics and land policies, and if you just look into how some pension funds, and most often it's not pension funds directly in Vienna, owning the land in Vienna, but it's Danish pension funds being embedded in some investment in Vienna or vice versa somewhere. Totally. But I think that, again, it comes to this moment that it's like the banks. The system is too large to fail, right? We are like the more we are embedded, and that is the problem. That the more this gets entangled, the more this gets embedded, the more difficult the system is to change, and that's exactly what the system wants. I mean, logically. So this is why I think, and I'm not an etatist. I'm not a fetishist of governmental approach only. But I think that at this moment, we really need to employ whatever is possible to cut wherever it is still possible. And that's why I really appreciate bottom-up, like all these initiatives that try to get it out of the market, which is the Mietshaussyndikate, which is Habitat, which are such structures. Genossenschaften are historically exactly, and this is where Switzerland is so important, and Zurich, and Vienna, and even nearly every city has some sort of history of alternative. Some of them, have cut it more, another cut, have done the other cut earlier more, the others not. But what I usually say is the best thing would be not to now also look for the global one answer to reverse it, because that's impossible, but that we would look into each city's history of their own conflict history, of their own alternatives embedded there. More or less successful. Sometimes these alternatives were only started and never got successful, but they are there. And they're more easy because then you're more contextual. That just doesn't help us yet over the global BlackRock and Vonovia and so other structures. And there, honestly, I think Berlin has the right answer, if you ask me. If you want to have the entanglement, the embedment of Vonovia cuts, buy it.
I would like to add something to what was just brought up.
Yeah.
The first thing to the question of how real estate is a financial product. The European Greens just did a study on that under the name My Home is an Asset Class that exactly researches into that. And I think this is highly interesting, especially as well for architects, because we need to get politically involved on that topic. The European Union apparently now tries to find financial policy resolution on that now. And what is quite interesting is actually that data is not available or missing. And that links back as well to the situation in Berlin, that you just don't know who buys the stuff. And I think I'm not entirely agreeing. I think we need to have bigger plans and literally plans what to do on the housing level as well as small solution. Because when you look at what is happening in Berlin now is that I'm living in Berlin. That's why I'm very much emotionally involved in this topic as well. Franziska Giffey said, even before the election, that she would not go for the Vergesellschaftung.
I know.
So there was this kind of we're not going to do it whatever you vote by the SPD. I mean, it's a social party and they are not doing anything.
I know.
So it's we need to really work on all ends that are available.
Completely.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and I think that this is why I'm also happy to work in Germany now, because I really want to get involved with this idea of building 400,000 units of housing now. Yeah? The question again is, how do you build them in an ecological crisis? Or also question, yeah, you don't just build. The solution to the housing crisis is not anymore build, build, build. The solution must be redistribute also. Because if we have a crisis of cement, a crisis of steel, reinforced concrete, a crisis of wood, a crisis if we now build everything of wood, then we have no forests anymore in Romania, and so on. We all know the story. Yeah? So the old social democratic logic of solving a housing crisis is to build and build and build, and this is even what I showed. Now the new, let's say, the new Red Vienna would be maybe in a radical way not to build a single one anymore, but to only see where is vacancy, where is much too much, luxury tax in another way. Yeah? Not you don't pay for your luxury, but you redistribute your space. Yeah? This is super radical. I mean, this is beyond kind of what asking Vonovia, buying off in Vonovia for a high price, yeah? or Deutsche Wohnen AG. But this is if we bring together the ecological movement, yeah, kind of Fridays for Future, and the ecological crisis and the social crisis, then this is where we will get to. And this will be very difficult because some people will have to lose something.
I'm adding.
Yeah.
Can I add a question before because you made this one point, you said architects are not activists or something like that.
No,
but basically
they should be.
they should be. But so you kind of said we cannot do everything, but you are literally an activist on that topic. So how do you? I mean, we could see that you talk, that you plan, that you do both. What kind of recommendation would you give to the younger generation? How can we implement that in our work?
I can only give you one. I'm asked this very often, and I remember when I much earlier, not yet so activist or so, I was sometimes in such panels, but quite often interdisciplinary. And I was sitting there as the architect and urban planner, and I was the enemy. No, we are the enemy to activists or to those who actually are fighting in a way, yeah? Because we are seen as those who are pairing up with the developers, with those who speculate, and those who evict. Yeah? But of course, we also build. But first, others are evicted in a way. Yeah, in some of the logic. So, if I could give one piece of advice, I think the key is to gain trust, and I think that's something we all need to gain. We need to gain trust by those highly affected by what architecture and urbanism is at this moment setting up. And gaining trust means not necessarily going, sometimes I say this as a joke, you don't go to now leftist parties and put your credit cards out and say like, hey, I'm your guy. This is where, but it is, I didn't even plan that, but I was interested in being at these places that were not only architectural places, or that were not only being interested, being there, getting engaged, but this is what I see now in the young generation anyway. But what I would like to bring across is that you can link it with the profession. And that's actually how can you, in this book, is much more theory about how we could, for instance, with this agency thing, how can we gain trust and how can we build alliances? To build alliances, we to some extent have to de-learn architecture, or at least de-learn to behave like an architect. That's literally, because how can you find a collective language if you speak a special language? Yeah? How can you build trust if you, I don't know, speak arrogantly, or I don't know, and so on. So in a way, it's a bit of a self-distancing of our own profession. At the other hand, it's full involvement in our profession. So it's in a way, it's a double movement. Yeah? That does not mean that we're not more involved within the profession. Yeah? So it sounds counterintuitive, but I hope you get it a bit. Yeah? Some things we have to distance ourselves maybe, and this is very simply, it's also the same idea of like, if architecture means build, 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 we will have to learn to find ways to do architecture and not build. Yeah? Or rebuild. I mean, we all know the stories, and I think all the universities are already far there to say we need to much more refurbish, change, continue the city rather than build on the green field. Still, I mean, too many projects are literally somewhere, I don't know, in the green field.
Yeah, actually, this is the point where I jump in. You gave the word. I think de-learning something, maybe it's about discussing and defining what has to be learned and what is going to be learned. So maybe it's, at the moment it's de-learning, but maybe also your talk can open up the discussion on new implications for learning to become architect, he architect. I think the challenges have changed, and they will change dramatically, I'm sure about that. So in ecological terms, in economic terms, and in social terms. And there will be new questions, and the time is limited to find kind of solutions or non-solutions for these challenges. I'm pretty sure. And I think we should start, right, like you did it, we should maybe start trying out alternative models and linking the existing models. For example, Mietshäuser Syndikat, it exists in Basel. There are projects and they're spreading because it's a proved model, alternative model. So if you don't know about it, check it out. And there are also, cooperative movements, of course, in Switzerland, but still, I mean, their share of all all rented apartments in whole Switzerland is maximum 8%, and it's not growing. So this is a critical point also. There's no perspective of having a change in this in Switzerland, maybe in Swiss cities, and they have different logics and different histories, which is unique actually. Zurich or Biel are worthwhile studying them and studying their land politics and housing politics, but it's quite difficult, you know, to really paint a picture of whole Switzerland. This is, for me, it's interesting to learn from you what could be non-solutions for this housing problem in the cities as we have it today. What could that be in your eyes? Or
I mean, I'm also, as you can guess, I'm also involved in, I'm being asked by politics, by academics, and also by activists. And this I really love. I must say it's so nice to and it's very difficult. Sometimes I have exactly the wrong tone in the wrong place and so on. It doesn't matter. But for instance, when in housing, yeah, if I were a politician, if I have a housing crisis in my city, I would not see why I would give any single possibility to build private housing until I have raised my number of collective housing association or cooperative housing. Now you may say that's not possible. In a way, it is possible because a lot is possible. It's so much is possible. You have. I mean, I did a study. I could bore you with all the instruments that are existing. Yeah? There is Widmung of Zeit, there is Vorkaufsrecht, there is possibilities, so many possibilities that cities could actually employ to slowly, step by step, turn around the proportion. Not quick. I mean, you cannot. Then you would really have to expropriate everyone and so on. But even slowly. But the other thing that I find so fascinating is rent control. If we would all fight for good rent control, the pleasure and the lust of the capital to invest in housing would go down. Because if you cannot make your own profit by somebody else's needs in housing, they will still do profit somewhere else and we will have another problem somewhere. But, I mean, it makes such a difference. And this is exactly why those who want to do the profit are highly against rent control and highly against the Mietenpreisdeckel and so on. But then again, I don't understand if so many people are having the same problem. I mean, this is what frustrates me really, that there's not more power, I don't know, on the street, in the news. And that's why I think every one of us can make a difference. I even try to really see in the students that, you know, you make the nicest design, this roof. And it would be nice if you also kind of discuss who owns the land this roof stands on, and how was it paid, and how is it repaid, and what's its kind of, is it public, private, and so on. And to do both, because of course we don't want now kind of, there is the social architecture, or there is the kind of, how should we say that, political correct, and there is the beautiful one. No, we should do very beautiful, but kind of in this political context. Yeah? That's why it's also political and not social. I think we should maybe even call it political housing, but that's not so sexy.
Yes, Gabus, thanks for your lecture. I in particular liked your concept of your critical Setzung. And you mentioned a couple of times the historic relevance that you're building into your projects and in your observations. I'm wondering, you know, there's an old saying by one of your heroes, Hannah Arendt, I think it was the extreme left, on your picture.
You mean literally or?
No, well, okay.
No.
You know, at the end of the day, in each time you have to find your own crisis and your own answers to repair what you have, right? And perhaps if you're looking at the current refugee crisis, which is growing, there is an aspect also in your presentation about the quantitative and qualitative thinking. I think you pointed out a couple of times if that would be boring to the students and everybody else sitting in here. I think there's a big power in that to manage at the same time those two trajectories. I think it's not done enough. That's probably missing. Marie, you said what is missing in education. I think these economics, we have to know a bit better to also make the argument in it. And at the end of the day, the calculation in Vienna that was done, that I just read about, is that without doing anything, using the Leerstand, using more a dynamic lens, you could house 100,000 people in the city. So if that works for refugees, also you can say, you know, if we have another image on our houses, on our space that we use, and the crisis is now a refugee crisis by a drastic war situation in the neighborhood, you could obviously say, well, by the same means, making more popular some of the models you showed at the end also, using social media, etc., you could access those 100,000 units. And to end with one example, we have been in the summer quite a bit in Favoriten, which is suddenly a hip place after being on the other side of the railroads for the last 100 years. And it seems that there are obviously areas where the city could act very quickly. You said it takes time, but you also said we need to be fast. And I think if one combines and finds and seizes the opportunities that crises provide, perhaps along the lines seeing possibilities here and also putting them into projects, I find that was the strongest part of your presentation. Mm-hmm. Because I think the critique, you know, we are preaching a bit to the choir probably, but I think the examples, that's the really powerful part. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't like so much to exploit refugees. I mean, I'm, of course, as you can imagine, part of this activism is all about, it started with that. And one basis to what we're discussing is that we live in a migration society. Now we have, logically, we have a real crisis, a real exemption crisis. And I really, I mean, we all know people in the Ukraine, I'm sure, and hopefully support and so on. But I agree with you, with or without dividing between refugees and non-refugees, because whoever is here has the right to be here. I mean, I love this saying, wie geht's, wer da ist, ist da, wie geht das, ein schöner Spruch, jeder, der da ist, ist von da. Ne? Mhm. Jeder, der in dem Moment da ist, ist immer schon von da. Ne? Es gibt diesen Unterschied nicht zwischen, ich bin von da und der ist von dort. In dem Moment, wo er da ist er von da. And this will now also happen. But with the vacancy numbers in Vienna, it's the same issue. The numbers are not so clear. Now they estimate, yeah, before there was no numbers, now there's numbers. What we need is knowledge. Yeah? And universities could do so much. They could produce so much information and knowledge about such issues. Like, how much is the vacancy in Zurich, do you know? How could you actually find out, etc., etc.? But we, again, this is preaching to the converted, I'm sure. Question is only if we do it.
I have a question, but I leave the microphone to Jennifer first, because I open up a new chapter.
Okay. If you're still energetic.
Well, no, first of all, thank you for your excellent lecture. It was really very inspiring, and I think you showed so much what architects can do, and I think in that sense it was really nice that you had very concrete examples of how you can act in this field and to do something. And I liked very much your concept of non-building plan, because it, of course, it's always tempting for an architect to propose an intervention, and to dare saying no, we should do nothing is really very important. And I think you showed very much what type of urban quality that can create when you don't do anything. And so I was wondering, and to some extent you already answered that question, whether this concept of non-building can also, and in which domains, and how can it also be applied to housing, because you use it in relation to public space. You mentioned already, after actually said quite a lot about that before I could answer my question, but I wonder maybe one domain you didn't touch is the whole issue of demolition of houses and transformation. You said, the importance of calculating vacancy rates and to redistribute existing housing rather than building new houses just to make up for houses that are there. I just come back from Latin America, and there it was full of slogans saying no houses without, in Spanish of course, but no houses without people, no people without houses. So that was really the slogan that was very much shouted in the streets now in Uruguay in particular, and also in Argentina. And I think also in that domain, I mean, what is the potential and what type of non-building plans do exist in the domain of housing beyond the one we already mentioned, in terms of also transformation of existing housing or preventing demolition or, yes, revaluing what is already there?
I think there's starting policies, and I mean, of course, this is what I just mentioned. I want to really get engaged with the policies of creating this 400,000 housing units in Germany, and part of it should be redistribution and non-building. No? Not all of it, but part of it. So this plan has to be drawn in a way. But also, I really highly admire a simple thing that Ada Colau in Barcelona actually activates a law that has always been there, to now finally, when the crisis gets so big, to quasi temporarily expropriate banks that have, after the economic crisis of 2007-8, have actually seized these places, the apartments, and since then they have been sitting still and empty. And logically, there is a law saying if you have a housing crisis in a certain area and you have houses sitting empty, you can demand them. That's something that also Red Vienna could do. Red Vienna had a so-called Wohnungsanforderungsgesetz, which does not mean Wohnungsförderungsgesetz, but Wohnungsanforderungsgesetz. And maybe actually I did not, I should have brought that, because now it's interesting. What we always need is a policy mix. You can have good rental control, but you could still have lots of empty houses, because if people can afford it, they just have them sit empty. I won't get anybody in there, because anyway I don't earn money by it and so on. We have a lot of vacancy like this. Now, such a Wohnungsanforderungsgesetz, or what Ada Colau is doing, is seizing a possibility to demand these apartments, to take them and rent them over. It doesn't even mean, it's not even expropriation, it's only taking them for a while, renting them and paying money over there. So it's only, in a way, not even forcefully, but legally making sure that these houses are coupled with somebody who lives in it. And if we think ecologically, we know that houses age better if they have people living in it. That's even a kind of ecological, even a kind of Bruno Latour argument. A built place out of stone needs a person to take care of, otherwise it deteriorates quicker. I mean, that's proven. Yeah? So there's so many gains from bringing this together, but it needs absolute political will, because you still have to. You have to actually, it's another way of showing, what we would have to show, and it would be a beautiful diagram, how much a single vacant apartment costs us all, sitting there fully ignorantly, arrogantly, selfishly, while all the infrastructure runs around. Yeah? Subways are running, trams are running, it's being cleaned all around and so on. And we need to have another place somewhere outside of the city and build more infrastructure. I mean, if we just start to make that visible and understandable, I think then it would also be another societal understanding, because I don't think that anybody is shamed now by having an apartment empty. Yeah, but I think there should be something like possibly shaming for having worthful apartments. Sit still if you own them. And so on. There's like work on so many levels, and then there's the big plan that you mentioned. Yeah. So yeah. but
Yeah,
there's so many people in the room, and if everybody just takes up some, and you are in the politics now, we have all the hopes in you.
Yeah, I know. But bringing in more transparency and just showing, I mean, doing research and showing. So I think our journalists also started putting up maps of ownership of land and let's say empty apartments also in cities. So bringing together all the pieces of knowledge and putting it together, puzzling it so that it gets more value for the public. I think this is a big work still to do. The information is not always provided very happily and, you know, transparently, but it is there. And I think this could also be, you know, one of the learnings for future architecture and planning students, how to get to the information and how to critically reflect the information. And this, yeah, up to you also. This is up to you. But I want to open another chapter just shortly because it's the evening before the Athena, before the parity talks, and it's the Athena lecture. And we always invite women intellectuals or architects or planners, and so from my professional curiosity also, I would like to invite you to tell us, how do you work? So how is your practice? Is it a team? How do you organize yourself? How did you start? What did you do different? Or, you know, what is the biography of your work practice? Can you share that with us? Maybe this is also interesting.
I think one of the key moments of my biography really was the luck to get to know Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. Pure luck. I'm not at all, I'm neither a relative nor have ever known her before. I was literally only looking for an apartment in Vienna, and somebody said, Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky is looking for somebody moving into her apartment next to her, which was her pension plan, in a way to get old by living alone and having a little apartment next to her, to be able to rent out to somebody for cheap, who should be a woman, as she wanted a friend, who should be, I mean, maybe a student because it was a cheap and small place, and who should have something to do with architecture. And that was me in person, but I was not the only, there was like more people. She was very, very tough woman, knew what she wanted. In a way, I was very young student. But I mean, to find, this is of course, to learn and find such figures is amazing. That's why I do think that parity talks and these moments to really think of role models and to ask ourselves, who are our role models? I think that's one of the key things. I think there has to be a big shift in change of role models. One thing. The other, and you saw it, I mean, that doesn't mean that you don't critique, yeah? And also, again, that we don't inherit blindly something which 100 years later we would have to say, hey, it has to become different, yeah? And the other thing is that I also just, I mean, I worked in office, and I did a postgraduate at Princeton. That was important to me because it opened up my literally theoretical work. Because in Vienna we had a lot of practice. I mean, we got very independent, but I really enjoyed reading, writing, learning how to frame an argument. I think that's super important because at the end, we are somehow public figures, yeah? Not only by what we draw and build, but also by how we describe it or how we embed it. And other than that, now I don't know. I hopefully will not be make people angry, but very early I was very bold when I started to set up I won the first competition, which didn't get realized anyway. But I said and I did one apartment work, and I was so bored by speaking for 20 times about the bathroom fixtures. I was like, no, this cannot be my profession. And I told myself that I want to do public things. I want to actually work on public issues that relate to more people, and housing is not so public, but at least that it's not just by those people and their private taste, so to say. And then I put on my website, since then I have it, I will not build suburbanizing one-family houses. And then many young architects said, like, how can you say that? Because it's our most important first job. Yeah? And then I said, well, it's ridiculous. We cannot write against suburbanization, but then work on it. Yeah? And honestly, yes, I may have certainly not gotten some first commissions, but then you also work 2-3 years on a one-family house. I mean, spend this time on something else. And anyway, we shouldn't have. I mean, Salzburg already banned, I think it's Salzburg, there's already places that banned one-family houses, and this will be the next thing that will happen. Yeah? There's nothing more, I mean, preaching to the converted, you all know it, but we should not do it anymore. So doing competitions, but also teaching a bit. But I have to say something. I lived in New York, I lived in Japan, I lived in Holland. I moved back to Vienna. And maybe something that makes me really such an activist. There's nothing better than not to have existential fears. And the greatness of Vienna, that you can live there with not needing so much money, makes you free. The question is really, how can we all get free to do only what would be the right thing? Because I would not claim to say anybody should just drop their jobs, because I mean everybody has to somehow sustain something. But this is why I really believe if housing becomes affordable, if there's public transportation available, if there's access to culture free, if there's spaces that we can meet and discuss and have whatever we do, if we can go to a club for free and not pay a lot of money and dance, this is all the qualities which actually do not force us into works that we may not want to do or that we shouldn't even do. Yeah? And I think this is where housing is the super most basal condition. And Vienna is still quite affordable, and I'm not sure how my practice would have turned into had I stayed in Amsterdam or in New York. Mm-hmm. But you know, there's a lot of people in Vienna who cannot afford housing. I mean, this still in every city you have an extreme disparity of luck and not depending on. But still, I believe really, let's work on securing people's independence, in people's possibilities to be free in what they do. Big word of what we need to do, I know. It's like only that.
I mean, this is it's a very nice last word. Actually, I was just curious if you work in a team in your office,
sorry,
or you know,
course,
how
yes.
you organize your
I'm
work.
sorry. Okay, so
how do you cope with all that?
We have an office in the 7th district in Vienna, a house that was a factory before. There's, I think, 12 architecture offices in there. That helps to be in a context where you work together. We are 6 people in my office. At this moment, only women. That's not a necessity, but it happened to be like this. We organize ourselves in a way that everyone is responsible, and there's no such thing as only working on towards something. We're trying very quickly that everybody does kind of everything. We always have collective meetings so that everyone knows all the projects, so that we can support each other. And then it really needs good organization. That's something we're constantly working on, to get to be efficient and good organized. Because at the end of the day, as you can imagine, some of these projects are not logically paid well. But, I mean, I could have also give you a lecture on only our exhibition architecture, for instance. We just opened an exhibition yesterday in the Frauenmuseum Hittisau, also relating nicely to parity talks on Scheinehen, which is, how would you translate that? Fake marriages that Jewish women had to get into in order to flee during Nazi time. Extremely current. This Frauenmuseum Hittisau, great museum in Vorarlberg, has a cooperation with the Gender Museum in Kiev. Just did the last exhibition together. Of course, now all of the opening was standing under this crisis and the support of it. And even honestly, the idea of what you need to organize yourselves to be able to flee, even though you cannot compare Nazi time ever. I mean, we know that, but still there is exactly the question of like, who is able at this moment to flee from the Ukraine? I'm so proud of some friends who actually go there and now also try to get those out who are third country nations, who are not Ukraine, because now all of Europe says like, oh, please, everybody Ukraine come, but if you don't have a Ukraine passport and you are there, you are not accepted. So again, there's so much to constantly readjust within this even supposedly already better condition than after 2015. Yeah.
Do you offer internships in your office?
Yes, but internships are always so much work. So it has to be at least 6 months.
Okay.
We stopped kind of 3 months or so. It's like somebody comes in and goes and yes, okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.